Darnell's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the woman on the ground, her face twisted in pain. She clutched her stomach, gasping, sweat dripping from her forehead. "Help me. Please," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Darnell had only stopped to help her, just like his mom always told him to do when someone was in trouble. But now, flashing red and blue lights bounced off the wet pavement, sirens howling in the distance. The police were coming, and they weren't coming to help him. Darnell's fingers trembled as he held onto the woman's hand. She was about to give birth. He knew she needed help, but he also knew how this looked. A black teenager standing over a white pregnant woman, his hoodie pulled up to shield himself from the cold rain. The sound of screeching tires made his stomach drop. Doors slammed. Shouts filled the air. "Hands in the air! Now!" Darnell froze, his whole body locked up. The woman groaned, gripping his wrist tighter. "Don't leave me," she begged, her voice weak. The officers were closing in, their guns were out, and that was when everything changed. Darnell hadn't planned to be out this late. It started as a regular night. He had just finished basketball practice at the community center and was walking home, his sneakers splashing through small puddles on the sidewalk. The air smelled like rain, and the city lights shimmered on the wet streets. He didn't mind the walk. It gave him time to think. He was only a few blocks from home when he heard it. A car engine sputtering, followed by a loud thud. Then, silence. Darnell turned his head and saw the car, a silver sedan, stranded on the side of the road. Its hood was popped open, steam hissing into the night air. Inside, the driver's seat was empty. But when he stepped closer, he heard a faint noise. A groan. Someone was inside. His first thought was to keep walking. His mom always. Ayaz told him to be careful. "Darnell, baby, the world don't always see you for who you are," she'd say. "Sometimes they see what they want to see." But something about that groan. It didn't sound right. He walked closer, cautiously peeking through the window. That's when he saw her. A white woman, gripping the steering wheel, her face pale. She looked up at him, eyes wide with pain. "Are you okay?" Darnell asked, keeping his voice calm. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just shook her head, clutching her stomach. That's when he noticed. She was pregnant, and from the way she was breathing, something was very wrong. Panic twisted in his gut. "Do you need an ambulance?" he asked, already reaching for his phone. She nodded weakly. Darnell wasted no time. He dialed 911, his fingers shaking. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's a lady here. She's pregnant, and I think something's wrong. She's in her car." The dispatcher's voice cut through. "Can she talk?" Darnell looked at her. "Ma'am, can you?" The woman let out a sharp cry, her whole body tensing. She grabbed his wrist, her nails digging into his skin. "She's in pain," Darnell said urgently. "All right, stay calm. What's your location?" Darnell quickly gave the street name. The dispatcher assured him help was on the way, but it didn't feel fast enough. The woman's breathing became more erratic, her face twisting in agony. Darnell looked around. There were no other people nearby, just rows of darkened houses and parked cars. "You need to get out of the car," he told her, gently opening the door. She tried, but as soon as she stood, her legs buckled. Darnell caught her just in time. "I got you," he said. "It's going to be okay." He helped her onto the sidewalk, easing her down onto the curb. Rain drizzled down, soaking his hoodie, but he didn't care. He just needed to keep her calm. "What's your name?" he asked. She sucked in a shaky breath. "Jessica." "Okay, Jessica. Help's coming. Just hang in there." Tears welled in her eyes. I think the baby's coming." Darnell's stomach flipped. "What?" I think I'm in labor." Darnell swallowed hard. He had no idea what to do. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't even an adult, but Jessica looked at him like he was her only hope. "Please," she whispered. Darnell tightened his grip on her hand. "I got you," he promised. That was when he heard the sirens. He turned his head and saw them. 2 police cruisers speeding toward them. For a split second, he felt relief. Help was here. But then reality hit him. He was a black teenager kneeling beside a white woman in distress, and he knew exactly what this looked like. As the police cars skidded to a stop, doors flew open. Darnell's breath caught in his throat. He saw the guns before he heard the shouting. "Get your hands up! Now!" Jessica gasped, her body trembling in fear. Darnell's mind screamed at him to move, to say something, to explain. But all he could do was stare. The moment he had tried to do the right thing had turned into his worst nightmare, and it was only just beginning. Darnell's breath came fast and shallow. His hands hovered in the air, fingers trembling. The rain poured harder, drenching his hoodie, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. One wrong move, and this could go bad, real bad. The officers moved in fast, their faces hard and unreadable. One had his gun raised, the other had a hand on his holster. "Step away from her! Hands where we can see them!" Darnell swallowed hard. She needs help. She's having a baby." Jessica groaned, her body curling inward. "Please," she whimpered. "He was helping me." One of the officers, a tall white man with a sharp jawline, glanced at her before turning back to Darnell. "On your knees! Now!" Darnell's stomach clenched. Now!" Jessica let out another sharp cry, her hands clutching her stomach. Darnell hesitated. "If I let go, she might—" The other officer, a bald black man with a thick mustache, took a step forward, his gun still drawn. "Do what he says, kid." His voice was firm, but something in his eyes wasn't as cold as his partner's. Darnell sucked in a shaky breath and slowly lowered himself onto his knees, raising his hands higher. His heart pounded so loud it echoed in his ears. The sharp-jawed officer moved in, grabbing his wrists and yanking them behind his back. Cold metal snapped around them. "Handcuffs." "No, wait! I didn't do anything!" Darnell protested. Jessica gasped, struggling to push herself up. "Stop! He's helping me!" The bald officer glanced between them, his brow furrowing. "Hold up! What's going on here?" Jessica pointed at Darnell, her face twisted in pain. "I was stranded. My car broke down. He stopped to help me. I think I'm in labor." The officer hesitated. Darnell could see the conflict in his face. Meanwhile, the sharp-jawed officer didn't look convinced. He yanked Darnell to his feet. "Then why was he standing over you?" he asked, his tone sharp. Jessica groaned again, shaking her head. "Because I fell. He caught me. Please, you're wasting time. I need a hospital." The bald officer's eyes flickered with realization. He turned to his partner. "Mark, take the cuffs off him. She's vouching for him." Mark, the sharp-jawed officer, scowled but hesitated. Darnell's heart pounded. Was he about to listen? For a second it felt like everything had frozen. The rain, the sirens, even the breath in Darnell's chest. Then, Jessica let out a loud, piercing scream. Her entire body went rigid. She clutched her stomach, her face twisting in pain. "Something's wrong!" she gasped. I think the baby's coming now." Darnell barely had time to react before chaos exploded around him. An ambulance arrived minutes later, its red and white lights flashing like a beacon in the night. The paramedics rushed in, pulling out a stretcher. As they assessed the situation, "She's in full labor," one of them said. "We need to get her to the hospital now." Mark hesitated, glancing between Darnell and Jessica. His hand still hovered near his holster, his jaw clenched tight. The bald officer nudged him. "Come on, man. The kid didn't do anything wrong." Mark exhaled sharply. Then, without a word, he pulled out a key and unfastened the cuffs from Darnell's wrists. The metal fell away, and Darnell immediately rubbed his sore skin. Jessica reached for him weakly. "Please, don't leave." Darnell hesitated. The paramedics were already loading her onto the stretcher, but she was still looking at him. "I won't," he said firmly. Without waiting for permission, he followed them to the ambulance. One of the paramedics, a woman with a dark ponytail, glanced at him. "You family?" Darnell swallowed. "No, but I found her. She wants me to stay." Jessica weakly nodded. The paramedic hesitated before sighing. "Fine. Get in." Darnell climbed in beside her, barely believing this was happening. The moment the doors slammed shut, the siren wailed, and the ambulance sped off into the night. The ride to the hospital was a blur of chaos. Jessica's screams filled the small space, her hands gripping the sides of the stretcher. The paramedics moved quickly, checking her vitals, speaking in rushed medical terms Darnell didn't understand, but he didn't leave her side. She kept reaching for him, clutching his hand like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I'm scared," she whispered between contractions. Darnell squeezed her fingers. "You got this," he said. "Just breathe." Tears ran down her face. "I don't want to do this alone." "You're not alone," Darnell promised. It was a strange thing to say. He didn't even know this woman. Hours ago, he was just some teenager walking home. Now, he was holding her hand as she prepared to bring a new life into the world. He wasn't sure why, but he meant it. When the ambulance finally screeched to a stop, the back doors flew open and doctors rushed in. "Let's move her! She's crowning!" Everything happened so fast. Jessica was wheeled out, her screams echoing down the hallway. Darnell stood frozen. He wasn't sure if he should follow. Would they even let him? He wasn't family. He wasn't even supposed to be here. One of the nurses noticed him and smiled. "You coming, kid?" Darnell hesitated. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he nodded and followed them inside. Hours passed. Darnell paced in the waiting room, the smell of disinfectant thick in the air. He chewed his lip, bouncing his leg up and down. He had called his mom earlier, telling her everything. She had freaked out at first, but then sighed and told him to call if anything changed. Now, he was just waiting. Waiting to know if Jessica and her baby were okay. Waiting to see if he even mattered in all of this. Then, a door opened. A doctor walked out, smiling. "She's asking for you." Darnell blinked. "Me?" The doctor nodded. Darnell stood up slowly, his heart pounding all over again. The walk to Jessica's room felt unreal. When he stepped inside, he saw her lying in bed, exhausted but smiling, and in her arms, a tiny baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Jessica looked up at him with teary eyes. "I wanted you to meet him," she said softly. Darnell swallowed the lump in his throat. "What's his name?" She looked down at her son, her eyes full of warmth. "I was thinking, maybe Darnell." His breath hitched. Jessica gave a small, tired smile. "You saved us," she whispered, "and I want him to grow up knowing the man who did." Darnell's chest tightened. He had never expected this. Not in a million years. But as he stared at the tiny baby in her arms, something deep inside him changed. He had stepped in to help a stranger. And now, in the most unexpected way, he had become a part of something bigger than himself. Renelle stood frozen, staring at the newborn baby in Jessica's arms. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional cries from the nursery down the hall. Had he heard her right? Jessica wanted to name her baby after him? I don't know what to say," Darnell stammered. His voice felt too small for the weight of the moment. Jessica smiled weakly. "Say you'll hold him." Darnell's breath hitched. "Me?" She nodded and gently lifted the baby toward him. Darnell hesitated. He had never held a baby before. His hands still felt shaky from everything that had happened that night. But he couldn't say no. Carefully, he reached out, his arms unsure but steady. Jessica placed the tiny baby into his hands, and the second Darnell felt the newborn's warmth, something inside him shifted. The baby let out a tiny sigh, his fingers curling slightly as he nestled against Darnell's chest. A deep, strange feeling settled in Darnell's heart. He wasn't sure if it was pride, fear, or something else entirely. Jessica watched him closely, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but full of warmth. "You're a good person, Darnell." He swallowed hard. It didn't feel real. Hours ago, he had been just another black kid walking home, minding his business. Now, he was holding a newborn child, one who would carry his name. "Thank you," Jessica murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Darnell looked up at her. "For what?" "For stopping," she said. "For helping me when you didn't have to. For staying." Darnell didn't know what to say. He just looked back down at the baby, his tiny chest rising and falling. For a moment, everything felt okay. But then, the door swung open, and everything went wrong. A tall man stormed into the hospital room, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. His face was flushed red, his jaw tight with anger. "Jessica!" he barked. Jessica flinched, her face paling. Darnell instinctively stepped back, still holding the baby protectively. The man's eyes snapped to him, and the look he gave Darnell made his blood turn to ice. "Who the hell is this?" the man growled. Jessica swallowed hard. "Tyler, please!" "Tyler." Darnell didn't need to ask. He knew exactly who this was, the baby's father. Tyler's fists clenched as he took a step closer, his eyes blazing. He was tall and broad, his arms covered in tattoos. He looked like the kind of man who wasn't used to being told no. And right now, he was looking at Darnell like he was the problem. "Why is he holding my son?" Tyler snapped, pointing a rough finger at Darnell. Jessica's hands gripped the hospital blanket tightly. "Tyler, calm down." "I asked you a damn question." Tyler's voice boomed through the room, making the baby stir in Darnell's arms. Darnell's pulse pounded in his ears. He had been in situations like this before, when people looked at him and saw a threat instead of a person, when he had to calculate every single move to make sure things didn't go bad. Slowly, carefully, Darnell lowered his hands and stepped forward. "I was just helping," he said, his voice steady. Tyler's eyes flicked to the baby, then back to Darnell. His lips curled in disgust. "A black kid?" he scoffed. "This is a joke, right?" Jessica's face twisted in pain, but this time, it wasn't from labor. "Tyler, stop!" Tyler ignored her. His focus was locked on Darnell. "You trying to play hero?" he sneered. "Think just 'cause she's weak and alone, you can swoop in and take what's mine?" Darnell's jaw tightened. "I don't want anything from you," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I was walking home. She needed help. That's it." Tyler took another step forward, too close. Darnell's muscles tensed, his instincts screaming at him to be ready. But before anything could happen, a nurse rushed in, her face tight with urgency. "Sir, you need to lower your voice," she warned Tyler. "This is a hospital, and there are patients trying to rest." Tyler scowled but didn't move. Jessica's voice was shaky. "Tyler, just go home." His eyes snapped to her. "You serious?" "You're making a scene," she whispered. Tyler let out a bitter laugh. "A scene?" He glared at Darnell. "The real scene is you letting this kid hold my son while I'm not even here." Jessica clenched her jaw. "You weren't here because you left." Tyler's face darkened. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Tyler took a slow step back. His eyes never left Darnell, his face twisted with something ugly. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out. Darnell exhaled slowly. The nurse gave Jessica a worried look. "Do you need us to call security?" Jessica shook her head, her expression tired. "No, he's just angry." The nurse didn't look convinced, but nodded anyway. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." She shot Darnell a quick glance before stepping out. The second the door closed, Jessica let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she murmured. Darnell looked at her, still gripping the baby protectively. "You don't have to apologize for him," he said. Jessica looked away, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "I should have known he'd react like that." Darnell shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what to say. Jessica hesitated, then looked back at him. "You can go if you want. You've done more than enough." Darnell glanced down at the baby, who had settled back into sleep. Something inside him didn't want to leave. He should have. It wasn't his problem. But the way Tyler had looked at him, the way Jessica had flinched when he yelled, something told him this wasn't the end of it. Slowly, he handed the baby back to her. "I'll stay," he said quietly. Jessica's eyes softened. "You don't have to." Darnell shrugged. "Yeah, well, I'm not going anywhere." Jessica gave him a small, grateful smile. Darnell didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. Tyler wasn't done, and Darnell had just gotten himself involved in something way by gear than he ever expected. Darnell sat in the hospital chair, his knee bouncing up and down as he tried to shake the uneasy feeling in his chest. Tyler's words still echoed in his mind. "This ain't over." He had heard threats before. Living where he did, he knew how to read danger, how to feel it in the air. And right now, that feeling was all around him. Jessica lay in the hospital bed, rocking her newborn in her arms. She looked peaceful, but Darnell could see the worry just beneath the surface. She kept glancing at the door, like she was expecting Tyler to come storming back in at any moment. Darnell was expecting it too. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had dealt with people like Tyler before. The real fear, the thing that made his chest tighten, was for Jessica and the baby. A loud knock on the door made them both jump. Jessica sucked in a breath. "Oh, God." Darnell stood up instinctively, his muscles tensing. The door creaked open, and for a second he thought Tyler had come back. But it wasn't him. It was the bald officer from earlier. His uniform was still damp from the rain, and his expression was unreadable. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Hey, kid," he said, nodding at Darnell. Then his eyes flicked to Jessica. "Miss, I wanted to check in on you. Make sure everything's all right." Jessica hesitated. "Yeah, we're okay." The officer's gaze lingered on her face for a second longer, like he wasn't sure if he believed her. Darnell crossed his arms. "What's going on?" The officer sighed. "Your boy Tyler ain't home. We went by his place after he left here. His truck's gone, no sign of him." Jessica's fingers tightened around the baby's blanket. "Is that bad?" she asked. The officer gave her a steady look. "That depends. He been violent before?" Jessica looked away. That was all the answer Darnell needed. The officer nodded like he already knew. "Lou, Kay, I'm not here to push you, but if you want to file a report—" "No," Jessica cut in quickly. "Tyler's angry, but he wouldn't—" She stopped, shaking her head. "He just needs time." Darnell clenched his jaw. She doesn't even believe that. The officer exhaled through his nose, then turned to Darnell. "And you? You going home?" Darnell hesitated. He should. His mom was probably worrying herself sick. But something told him he needed to stay. "Nah," he said. "I'm good here." The officer studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said. "But kid, be smart. If that man comes back, call us. Don't try to handle him yourself." Darnell didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew. Tyler was coming back. And when he did, things were going to get real bad, real fast. Hours passed. The hospital dimmed as the night stretched on, the halls quieting down. Jessica had finally fallen asleep, her exhaustion catching up to her. The baby was curled against her chest, his tiny breaths steady. Darnell sat in the chair, his hoodie pulled over his head, but he wasn't tired. He was waiting. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., his gut told him. Something was wrong. He sat up, his senses going sharp. The air felt different. The hallway outside the door was too quiet. Then, a shadow moved under the door. Darnell's stomach dropped. He's here. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his heart pounding. He didn't want to wake Jessica. Not yet. The door handle turned. Darnell's breath caught in his throat. Then, the door swung open, and Tyler stepped inside. His eyes were wild, his movements stiff. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and there was a dark bruise forming on his cheek, like he had been in a fight. But the worst part? The way he looked at Darnell, like he was ready to kill him. Jessica stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Tyler, her face went pale. "Tyler," she whispered. Tyler's lips curled into a twisted smirk. "Hey, baby," he murmured. "Miss me?" Jessica's whole body tensed. "What are you doing here?" Tyler's gaze flicked to Darnell. "You tell me," he sneered. "Since you're all cozy with your new friend." Darnell took a small step forward, standing between Tyler and the bed. "You need to leave," he said firmly. Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You telling me what to do now?" he muttered. Jessica sat up quickly. "Tyler, stop. You're scaring the baby." Tyler's jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the tiny bundle in Jessica's arms. His son. His expression twisted. "You really named him after this kid?" Jessica swallowed hard but didn't look away. "Yes." Tyler's nostrils flared. "Unbelievable." Darnell could see it, the rage rolling off him in waves. Tyler wasn't thinking straight. He was running on pure emotion, and that made him dangerous. Darnell had been around men like him before, the type that didn't care about consequences, the type that would do something stupid just to prove a point. And right now, he was the point. Tyler's fists clenched. "I should beat the hell out of you," he snarled. Darnell's muscles tensed, his feet planting firmly on the ground. If Tyler swung, he wasn't sure if he could stop him, but he'd damn sure try. Jessica's voice broke through the tension. "Tyler, please, don't do this." Tyler's breathing was ragged. His body was shaking. Darnell could see the moment it happened, the moment Tyler realized this was bigger than just anger, that if he put his hands on Darnell, if he made the wrong move, he wasn't just losing control. He was losing everything. His eyes flicked back to Jessica, to the baby in her arms, to the life he had already started slipping away from. For the first time, Darnell saw something in Tyler's face that wasn't just anger, it was fear. A single tear slipped down Jessica's cheek. "Please, Tyler, just go." Tyler's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him. Jessica let out a shaky breath, holding the baby tighter. Darnell didn't move. He didn't trust that Tyler was gone, and his gut told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Darnell stood frozen, his breath slow and measured as he stared at the closed hospital door. Tyler had left, but the air in the room still felt suffocating, like his anger had left behind a thick residue that refused to fade. Jessica sat motionless on the hospital bed, her arms wrapped tightly around the baby, her shoulders trembling. She wasn't crying, at least not yet. She just held on to her son like she was afraid he might be taken from her. Darnell exhaled, forcing himself to relax. But deep down he knew. Tyler wasn't finished. Not yet. Jessica's voice was small. I think he's really gone." Darnell shook his head. "Nah." His gut twisted. "He's coming back." Jessica sucked in a shaky breath. "What do we do?" Darnell looked at her, then down at the tiny baby in her arms. And right then, he made a decision. "We get out of here," he said. The next few minutes moved fast. Jessica was still weak, but she pushed herself up, wincing as she carefully eased her legs over the side of the bed. The hospital gown clung to her thin frame, her exhaustion clear. But Darnell could see something else now: determination. She wasn't just going to sit and wait for Tyler to come back. Darnell grabbed her bag, helping her to her feet as she cradled the baby in one arm. "Where are we going?" she asked breathlessly. Darnell glanced at the clock. 3:07 a.m. The halls were empty. The nurses would be making rounds soon. "We gotta be fast," he muttered. "Before someone stops us." Jessica hesitated. "They'll know we left." "Yeah," Darnell admitted. "But that's better than waiting for Tyler to show up again." Jessica shivered but nodded. "Okay." Darnell cracked open the door, checking both directions. The hallway was dimly lit, quiet except for the distant hum of medical machines. "Come on," he whispered. Jessica tightened her grip on the baby and followed him. They moved quickly, Jessica leaning, G on Darnell for support as they slipped through the hall, past darkened patient rooms. Everything was going smooth until they reached the elevators. Darnell hit the button, his pulse pounding. The doors slid open, and standing inside was Tyler. Jessica gasped. Darnell's stomach dropped. Tyler's eyes locked onto them, his face dark and unreadable. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then he stepped out, and the doors slid shut behind him, trapping them in the hallway. Jessica took a shaky step back, instinctively shielding the baby. Tyler's jaw clenched. "You really trying to run?" Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore, Tyler." Tyler's fists curled at his sides. Darnell could see the war in his expression. A part of him wanted to lash out, wanted to grab her, to take control, to make her listen. But another part of him looked broken, like he already knew he'd lost. "I messed up," he muttered. His voice was thick, strained. "I know I messed up." Jessica didn't say anything. Tyler ran a rough hand over his face. I just wanted to be here, for him." His voice cracked slightly as his gaze flicked to the baby. "I didn't mean to—" Jessica cut him off. "I know, Tyler." Silence stretched between them. Then Jessica inhaled deeply. "But wanting to be here and deserving to be here are two different things." Tyler flinched. Jessica's grip on the baby tightened. "I don't feel safe with you anymore." Tyler swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed, his whole body stiff. Darnell held his breath. Tyler looked like he was about to snap. Then he took a slow step back. His eyes met Jessica's, filled with something raw and painful. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Darnell exhaled sharply. Jessica let out a shaky sob, her body trembling. Darnell didn't say anything. He just placed a steady hand on her shoulder. And this time, when they walked toward the exit, no one stopped them. Outside, the city was still dark, but the horizon was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jessica took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Darnell. "I don't know where to go," she admitted softly. Darnell glanced down the street, thinking. Then, he pulled out his phone and hit a number. The line rang once, twice. Then a groggy but familiar voice answered. "Darnell?" Darnell exhaled. "Ma, I need your help." His mom paused, instantly alert. "What's wrong?" Darnell looked at Jessica and the baby. Then, he turned his eyes toward the slowly rising sun. And for the first time all night, he knew they were going to be okay. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached Darnell's neighborhood. The warm light washed over the streets, chasing away the last remnants of the long, tense night. Jessica sat in the back seat of his mother's car, cradling her newborn, her fingers gently stroking his tiny cheek. Darnell sat beside her, his hoodie still damp from the rain, exhaustion clinging to his bones. But despite everything, there was a strange sense of peace settling over him. He had never expected any of this. He had never expected to stop that night, never expected to help deliver a baby, never expected to be handcuffed or threatened. And he sure as hell hadn't expected to change someone's life. Yet here he was. His mom parked in front of their house and turned in her seat, giving Jessica a warm but firm look. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "But this isn't just about running away, baby. It's about deciding what kind of life you want to build for that little boy." Jessica nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know." Darnell's mom gave her a knowing look. "And that starts with you standing up for yourself. No more waiting for Tyler to change." Jessica sucked in a breath. "I won't, Darnell B." He leaved her. She had been scared, but something had shifted in her. Something stronger now. Darnell's mom turned to him next. "And you," she said, shaking her head. "Lord knows I raised you to help people, but Darnell, baby, this was a lot." Darnell chuckled weakly. "Yeah, I know." His mom's eyes softened as she reached out, cupping his face for a moment. "I'm proud of you," she murmured. "But don't go making it a habit of getting into dangerous situations, you hear me?" Darnell smirked. "No promises." Jessica let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. For a moment, the weight of the last 24 hours seemed lighter, but Darnell knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Jessica would have to figure out how to move forward without Tyler. She would have to build a new life from scratch, one where she and her son were truly safe. And as for him, he didn't know what came next. But one thing was clear. That night, he had been more than just a kid walking home. He had been someone's lifeline. And maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. As he watched the morning light stretch across the sky, he realized something. Sometimes doing the right thing came with risks, but in the end, it was always worth it.